Rain pounded the roof of the car, turning the world outside into a blurry watercolor of gray. Evan Reed sat still, watching the Lakeview Police Department through the fogged windshield. The raindrops trickled down the glass in intricate patterns that resembled the branching neural networks he had spent the last decade designing. The clock on the dashboard showed 3:17. It didn't matter whether it was AM or noon. Time had long since become an abstract quantity for Evan, measured in lines of code and volumes of processed data. He ran a hand through the stubble that had grown over the last 3 days of non-stop work. His eyes were burning from lack of sleep and staring at computer screens. But now, sitting in this machine, he felt a strange clarity, as if all the previous years had been just preparation for this moment. 10 years ago, he left Lakeview, vowing never to return. The small town of 30,000, lost among the forests and lakes of the Midwest, had nothing to offer an ambitious MIT graduate with a PhD in machine learning. Silicon Valley beckoned with promises of million-dollar contracts and the opportunity to change the world. And he did change the world, creating algorithms that predicted consumer behavior with alarming accuracy, developing facial recognition systems, optimizing social networks for maximum retention of users' attention. He was one of the architects of the digital panopticon, in which every click, every request, every movement was converted into data that fed insatiable algorithms. Until one rainy evening, much like this one, his mother called him. "Lisa is dead, Evan." They found her body in the woods near North Lake. Lisa, his little sister. The one person who always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She stayed in Lakeview, became a school teacher, helped troubled kids find their way. She was a light in this gray town, and now her light has gone out. Evan blinked, pushing the memories away. He couldn't afford to feel emotion. Not now. What he needed now was the cold, calculating clarity of his mind. He stepped out of the car, ignoring the rain that instantly soaked his dark blue sweater and jeans. He clutched his laptop in a waterproof bag to his chest like his most precious possession. The Lakeview Police Department was housed in a red brick building that had been built in the 1930s. Inside, it smelled of old paper, coffee, and something vaguely institutional. An odor that seemed to have been ingrained into the very walls by decades of investigations, interrogations, and bureaucratic routine. Behind the reception desk sat an elderly sergeant with a gray mustache and the tired eyes of a man who had seen too many of the darker sides of human nature. "How can I help you?" he asked, giving Evan a professional look that instantly assessed the potential threat or extent of the problem. "I need to see Detective Chen, Maya Chen." "On what issue?" "Personal. Tell him Evan Reed is here, Lisa's brother." Something changed in the sergeant's gaze. Recognition flashed, then sympathy, quickly replaced by professional neutrality. "Wait. Here." Evan sat down on a plastic chair against the wall, his laptop bag resting on his lap. The hallway walls were covered with photos of former police chiefs and plaques honoring officers who had died in the line of duty. There was not a single woman or minority among them, a typical cross-section of the small conservative town. 5 minutes later, Maya Chen appeared in the hallway. She was a short woman with short black hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. Her face, with high cheekbones and almond-shaped eyes, looked inappropriately young for a detective. But her eyes showed an experience and weariness that belied her age. "Mr. Reed," she extended her hand to shake. "It's been a long time." Her handshake was firm and dry. the hand of someone accustomed to holding a weapon and taking control of the situation. 10 years, Evan replied. Can we talk in private? She nodded and led him through a maze of corridors to a small office filled with case files and boxes of evidence. On the wall was a board with photographs and notes tied together with red string, a classic detective tool unchanged by decades of technological advancement. Coffee? Maya suggested, pointing to the ancient coffee maker in the corner. No, thank you. I want to talk about my sister's case. Maya sat down at the table, gesturing for Evan to take the chair opposite. Mr. Reed. Evan, please. Evan, I understand your pain and desire for answers, but the investigation is still ongoing. We are doing everything we can to find who did this. It's been 3 months. Evan set the bag down on the table and unzipped it. 3 months, and no results. We have some leads, not good enough. He pulled out his laptop and opened it. Otherwise, you would have arrested the killer by now. Maya sighed, leaning back in her chair. What do you want, Evan? Why did you come back to Lakeview after so many years? Evan turned on his laptop, and the screen cast a blue light on his face, highlighting the deep shadows under his eyes and the tense line of his jaw. I came back to do what you couldn't do. Find my sister's killer and stop more murders. And how are you going to do this? Evan turned the laptop so that the screen was facing her. On the screen was a complex diagram with dozens of nodes and hundreds of connections between them. A visualization of a neural network, too complex for a non-technical person to understand. This is the Cassandra project, a crime prediction algorithm based on big data analysis and machine learning. Maya frowned, moving her gaze from the screen to Evan's face. Are you serious? You think a computer program can predict who will commit a crime? I don't just think it. I know it's possible. Evan pressed a few keys, and a new chart appeared on the screen, more structured, with color coding and numerical indicators. We already do this in marketing, predicting what product a consumer will buy based on their previous behavior, demographic data, psychographic profile. We do this in medicine, predicting the likelihood of developing diseases based on genetic markers and lifestyle. He paused, looking straight into Maya's eyes. Why not apply the same principles to crime, especially violent crime, which often follows predictable escalation patterns? Maya crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture that conveyed both skepticism and defensiveness. What you're talking about sounds like science fiction or dystopia. Minority Report in real life. The technology already exists. Evan closed his laptop. It's just a matter of how you apply it. I'm not suggesting you arrest people before they commit a crime. I'm suggesting a tool that will help you focus resources where they're really needed. And how exactly does your algorithm work? Evan felt like he had broken through the first line of defense. Beneath Maya's skepticism was interest, the professional curiosity of a detective who had seen too many crimes go unsolved due to a lack of resources or information. Cassandra analyzes a variety of factors, from the obvious, like criminal history and socioeconomic status, to more subtle ones, like changes in speech patterns on social media, shopping behavior, and movement data. The algorithm looks for correlations that the human brain simply can't detect due to the volume of data. Where do you get this data? Maya's voice took on a suspicious tone. Most of what you listed is protected by privacy laws. Evan looked away, the first sign of uncertainty since he'd arrived at the station. Let's just say, I have access to certain databases through my previous work. and I've developed methods for aggregating publicly available information that are in a legal gray area. In other words, you are doing something semi-legal. I'm doing what's necessary to prevent tragedies like Lisa from happening." Evan's voice broke with emotion for the first time, a mixture of anger and pain. "You were the lead detective on her case. You saw what was done to her. Tell me you wouldn't want to have the tool that could have prevented that." Maya was silent, and in her silence Evan saw an internal struggle between the duty of a law enforcement officer, obliged to follow the letter of the law, and the human desire to protect the innocent at any cost. "Suppose I am interested," she finally said. "How would that work in practice?" "I've already run the algorithm on Lakeview and the surrounding area. In a few days, Cassandra will produce the first list of people with a high probability of committing violent crimes in the next 3 months. You can establish covert surveillance of the most dangerous candidates. Do not arrest them, do not violate their rights, just observe, and intervene if you see signs of preparation for a crime. What if your algorithm is wrong? What if it flags innocent people as potential criminals?" "No system is perfect," Evan admitted. "But Cassandra doesn't pass judgment. It only points the way for further investigation. The final decision always rests with the individual." Maya stood up and went to the window. The rain was still pouring, turning the street into a mirror reflecting the dim lights of the city. "Why Cassandra?" she asked without turning around. In Greek mythology, Cassandra had the gift of foresight but was cursed. No one believed her prophecies. Evan allowed himself a weak smile. "I hope my Cassandra will avoid such a fate." Maya turned to him, her face serious. "I cannot officially sanction the use of your algorithm. You understand that, right? If information comes out about illegal data collection, about profiling citizens without a warrant, it will be the end of my career, and perhaps the beginning of your prison term. I'm not asking for official sanction." Evan stood up, packing the laptop back into his bag. "I'm simply offering information as an anonymous source. What you do with it is your decision." He took a small flash drive out of his pocket and put it on the table. "Here are the contact details. Encrypted email, untraceable. When Cassandra returns the results, I'll contact you." Maya looked at the flash drive without touching it. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't," Evan said simply. "But you knew Lisa. You knew the kind of person she was. She believed that everyone deserved a chance at a better life, even those troubled kids she worked with who everyone else had written off." He zipped up the bag and threw it over his shoulder. "I'm offering you a chance to prevent tragedies like the one that happened to her. A chance to save lives. Isn't that why you became a police officer?" Maya was silent, but Evan could see that his words had reached their target. She took the flash drive and hid it in her pocket. "I don't promise anything," she said, "but I'll see what you send." Evan nodded and headed for the door. He paused at the threshold. "Detective Chen, Maya, thank you for not giving up, for still looking for the one who killed Lisa. I will find him." Her voice was steely with determination. "With or without your help." Evan walked out of the police station into the rainy night. Drops of rain pattered on his jacket, but he barely noticed them. His mind was already far away, in a world of algorithms, probabilities, and predictions. He got into his car, placed his laptop bag on the passenger seat. His phone screen lit up with a notification, a message from his landlord. confirming that the keys to his new office were ready for pickup. Evan started the engine, turned on the wipers, sweeping away streams of water from the windshield. A long night of work lay ahead. Cassandra required refinement, fine-tuning of parameters, optimization of the neural network weighting coefficients. But for the first time in the 3 months since Lisa's funeral, Evan felt something like hope. He was creating a tool that could change the game, a tool that could save lives. He couldn't save Lisa, but maybe he could have prevented more victims, and if that meant walking the line on the law, invading people's privacy, using methods that many would consider unethical, well, that was a price he was willing to pay. After all, algorithms have no morals. They just do what they're programmed to do. And Evan programmed Cassandra for one thing: to find potential killers before they commit their crimes. The rest was just a matter of probability and statistics. And in this world, Evan Reed felt right at home. The office Evan rented was on the third floor of an old industrial building that had been converted into commercial space. Brick walls, exposed beams, huge windows, the kind of loft that would have cost a fortune in San Francisco, but was a pittance in Lakeview compared to California prices. Evan transformed the empty space into a workstation in record time. 6. High-resolution monitors connected to a powerful server occupied the central wall. To the right of them was a whiteboard reminiscent of the one in Maya's office. But instead of photos and notes connected by red strings, there were code printouts, neural network diagrams, and probability distribution graphs. On the left is a makeshift living area, a fold-out couch, a mini fridge, a coffee maker. Evan practically lived here, leaving the office only for short walks to clear his head and even shorter trips to the grocery store for energy bars and instant noodles. Now he sat in front of the monitors, watching as Cassandra processed another array of data. Lines of code flashed across the screen at a speed inaccessible to human perception, but Evan did not need to read them. He felt the work of the algorithm intuitively, like a musician feels his instrument. 6 days of non-stop work, fine-tuning settings, fixing bugs. 6 days on the brink of exhaustion, sustained only by caffeine, adrenaline, and obsession. And now, finally, Cassandra was ready to produce the first results. Evan launched the final compilation and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his sore eyes. An indicator bar appeared on the central monitor, slowly filling with green. 17%, 23%. 42%. His gaze fell on a framed photograph, the only personal adornment in the austere office space. Lisa at her graduation, diploma in hand, beaming, with that special smile that always made everyone smile back. Next to her was Evan, 10 years younger, with less gray hair and a less hard-lined mouth. They stood embracing. 2 orphans who had been through the foster system, but still connected to each other. "I'll find him, Liz," Evan whispered to the photograph. "I swear to you." A beep brought his attention back to the monitor. The compilation was complete, and Cassandra produced the first list. 12 names with probability values ranging from 67.3% to 94.1%. Evan scrolled through the list, studying the profiles of people the algorithm had flagged as potential criminals. Ray Dawson, 38, an Afghanistan veteran with diagnosed PTSD, a history of domestic violence, and an increasing presence on hate forums, 94.1% likely to commit a violent crime in the next 3 months. Marcus Fisher, 42, schoolteacher, recently divorced, financial problems, increasing isolation from social contacts, search queries on topics related to guns, 87.6% probability. Jason Turner, 25, history of minor offenses, recently fired from job, increasing. Alcohol consumption, conflicts with neighbors, 82.4% probability. Evan selected the 3 candidates with the highest scores and compiled brief profiles, including key risk factors, possible triggers, and monitoring recommendations. He encrypted the files and sent them to an anonymous email address he left with Maya. Then he sat back in his chair, looking at the list of names on the screen. 12 people who, according to Cassandra, were most likely to commit violent crimes in the coming months. 12 potential criminals, 12 potential victims, 12 destinies that now depended on the algorithm he had created. Evan felt the weight of this responsibility, but he had no doubt in his decision. The technology was neutral, neither good nor bad in itself. Everything depended on how it was used, and he was going to use Cassandra to save lives, even if it meant breaking a few laws, even if it meant invading people's privacy, even if it meant becoming the very thing he once despised, a man who believed the end justified the means. It was getting light outside. The rain had finally stopped, and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds, painting the wet rooftops of Lakeview in shades of gold and copper. A new day, and the beginning of a new experiment that could change the future of law enforcement or create a monster that will get out of control. But Evan preferred not to think about that, at least for now. Cassandra's first prediction came true 18 days later. Evan was sitting in his office, surrounded by the bluish glow of his computer screens, when a message from Maya Chen appeared on his smartphone screen. Turn on the news. Now. He reached for his laptop and pulled up a local news site. Live footage from the scene of the incident, a residential area on the outskirts of Lakeview, police cars with lights flashing, yellow tape, a reporter with a microphone speaking, amid the bustle of emergency services. We repeat, about an hour ago there was an attack at 1457 Oak Street. According to preliminary information, Raymond Dawson, 38, attacked his neighbor James Collins with a knife after a lengthy conflict over a parking space. Thanks to the timely intervention of the police, the victim received only minor injuries and is now in a city hospital in stable condition. The attacker has been detained. Evan turned off the sound and leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Satisfaction that the algorithm had worked with alarming accuracy. Relief that the police had intervened before the situation became fatal. And an unsettling awareness of the power that Cassandra gave, the power to foresee the future, to change destinies. The phone vibrated again. Maya. We need to talk. Today. 10 p.m. parking lot of the abandoned Aurora movie theater. Evan sent a quick confirmation and went back to work. He had spent the last 2 weeks continuously refining the algorithm, adding new parameters, expanding the database, optimizing the neural network. Cassandra was getting smarter, more accurate, delving deeper into the digital traces left by every Lakeview resident. Sometimes, in the rare moments of clarity between periods of frantic work, Evan wondered about the ethics of his project. About the fine line between preventing crime and creating a surveillance society. About what Lisa would say if she saw what her idealistic older brother had become. But these thoughts were quickly drowned out by a flood of code, data, and obsession. The abandoned Aurora cinema stood on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a vacant lot overgrown with weeds. Once a place for dates and family outings, the center of Lakeview's cultural life. Now it was a dilapidated building with broken windows and a peeling neon sign that sometimes flickered with a ghostly light on rainy nights, as if trying to come back to life. Evan pulled into a far corner of the lot, turned off his headlights, and waited. 5 minutes later, a nondescript gray sedan pulled up next to him. Maya Chen got out and quickly slid into the passenger seat of his car. "No one was following you?" she asked by way of greeting. "No. Should I have?" Maya didn't answer. She simply handed him a folder with documents. Full report on the Dawson incident. Officially, it was a simple domestic assault. Unofficially, we had him under surveillance after receiving your information when he left the house with a knife. A patrol car happened to be nearby. Evan flipped through the report. The bare facts of the police report formed a story that Cassandra had predicted with alarming accuracy. A veteran with PTSD, financial problems, an escalating conflict with a neighbor, a trigger in the form of another dispute over a parking space. "It works," he said quietly. "The algorithm really works." "Yes." Maya stared straight ahead at the dark silhouette of the abandoned movie theater. "And that scares me more than I care to admit." "Why?" "We prevented a serious crime. Possibly saved a life. Because this is a game changer, Evan. We've arrested a man for a crime he hasn't committed yet. Technically, he only threatened to pull a knife, but thanks to your algorithm, we knew he wouldn't stop at the threats. Isn't that what preventative policing is all about? Intervening before things get out of hand?" Maya turned to face him, her face half hidden in shadow, but Evan could see the tension in the line of her jaw. "There's a difference between responding to obvious signs of a crime in progress and this. We watched Dawson for 2 weeks. Every move he made, every conversation he had. We knew he was going to snap before he even realized it." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "The police chief is impressed with the results. He wants to know where I got such precise information. So far, I've been getting by with generalities about confidential sources, but that can't go on forever." "What do you suggest?" "I need more information about how your algorithm works, what data it uses, how it determines probabilities. I need to be sure that we are not breaking the law more than is absolutely necessary." Evan hesitated. Cassandra was his baby, his secret. To expose her inner workings would be to give up control, to create vulnerability. "I can't show you all the code," he finally said, "but I can explain the basic principles, and I'm willing to discuss the ethical limits of the algorithm's use." Maya nodded, accepting the compromise. "What about the other names on your list?" "Fisher and Turner. We've put both of them under surveillance. So far, no obvious signs of planning a crime, but the tension is mounting, especially with Fisher. He was recently called to the school principal's office because of a parent's complaint of inappropriate behavior. Nothing concrete, but he's becoming increasingly isolated and irritable." Evan made a mental note to update Fisher's Cassandra profile with the new data. Perhaps his risk rating should be raised. "I'm working on a new version of the algorithm," he said. "More accurate, with additional parameters. An updated list will be ready soon." "How many names will there be in it?" "I don't know yet, but I'll focus on the highest probability cases, say top 5 or top 10. Maya nodded, then took a small voice recorder out of her jacket pocket and placed it on the dashboard. "Now tell me how Cassandra works." "In detail." Evan spent the next hour explaining how his algorithm worked, avoiding technical details, but providing enough information for Maya to understand the general concept. He talked about behavioral patterns that precede violent crime, about correlations between seemingly unrelated factors, about the ability of machine learning to detect patterns invisible to the human eye. Maya listened attentively, occasionally interrupting him with questions, sharp, precise, demonstrating a quick grasp of concepts far removed from her usual work. "You say the algorithm learns from historical data," she said when Evan finished, "but doesn't that risk perpetuating existing biases? If the police have historically been more likely to arrest certain groups of the population, wouldn't Cassandra reproduce that bias?" Evan was impressed by the depth of her understanding. "This is a real problem in machine learning," he acknowledged. "I have implemented several mechanisms to minimize algorithmic bias, including balancing training data and regularly auditing results. But it is impossible to completely eliminate this risk." "And yet, you believe the benefits outweigh the risks?" "Yes. Especially if you use the algorithm as a decision support tool rather than an automated sentencing system." Maya turned off the recorder and put it back in her pocket. "I agree to continue cooperation," she said after a pause. "But with conditions. First, all information goes only through me. No direct contact with other officers. Second, we use the data only for surveillance, not for direct action, without clear signs of an impending crime. Third, if I notice that the algorithm systematically discriminates against certain groups, we stop using it." "Fair enough," Evan agreed. "I have a condition. 2. You provide me with regular feedback on your results. This data is critical to improving the algorithm." They sealed the agreement with a handshake, formal and businesslike, but with a mutual respect that was absent from their first meeting. "Be careful, Evan," Maya said, opening the car door. "What we're doing, this is dangerous territory. Not just from a legal standpoint." "What do you mean?" "Knowledge is power, and the power to predict the future is almost a divine prerogative. Such power changes people, and not always for the better." With these words, she got out of the car and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Evan alone with his disturbing thoughts. Evan's office had become a veritable command center. 2 more monitors had been added to the 6, forming a semicircle around the workstation. The walls were covered with printouts of code, diagrams, and photos of people on Cassandra's list. A separate board displayed a map of Lakeview, with incidents linked to the algorithm's predictions marked. 3 weeks after meeting Maya in the parking lot of an abandoned movie theater, Cassandra made another accurate prediction. Jason Turner, the third on the original list, was arrested for assaulting his former employer. Thanks to prior surveillance, the police intervened before the situation escalated into something more serious. Evan worked on a new version of the algorithm, integrating data from real incidents to improve the accuracy of his predictions. He barely slept, subsisted on energy bars and instant noodles, and left the office only for short walks to clear his head. His obsession with Cassandra grew with each successful prediction. He saw the algorithm not just as a tool, but as an almost living being, an artificial intelligence that learned, evolved, and became wiser with each new array of data. The doorbell rang, startling him out of his stream of code. Evan frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, and few people knew where his office was. He walked up to the door and looked through the peephole. A woman of about 30 with short red hair and a determined expression stood on the threshold. In her hands she held a notepad and a dictaphone, the unmistakable attributes of a journalist. Evan opened the door but left the chain on. "How can I help you?" Dr. Reed? Evan Reed? The woman smiled, a professional smile meant to inspire confidence. My name is Rachel King, and I'm with the Lakeview Gazette. I'd like to talk to you about your work. I'm afraid you're mistaken. I don't give interviews. He was about to close the door, but the woman's next words stopped him. Even Project Cassandra? Your crime-predicting algorithm that helps Lakeview police arrest people before they commit serious crimes. Evan felt the blood drain from his face as he removed the chain and opened the door fully. Come in. Quickly. Rachel King walked into the office, looking with professional interest at the many monitors, the code printouts on the walls, the photographs of people on the Cassandra list. Impressive, she said. A veritable control center for the future. How do you know about Cassandra? Evan ignored the compliment, his voice tense. I'm a journalist, Dr. Reed. I notice patterns. In the last 2 months, Lakeview police have prevented 3 serious crimes thanks to anonymous tips. In all 3 cases, the officers were in the right place at the right time, as if by magic. That intrigued me. She paused, watching Evan's reaction. I started digging, talking to police sources, analyzing reports, connecting the dots. And the trail led me to you, a former machine learning specialist from Silicon Valley who suddenly returned to his hometown after his sister's murder. Renting an office with an industrial internet connection and using the power of a small data center. Evan was silent, feverishly calculating his options. Deny everything, threaten legal consequences, try to bribe. What do you want? He finally asked. An exclusive interview, Rachel answered without hesitation. The story of a revolutionary technology that could change the future of law enforcement. The man who created an algorithm that predicts crime. And if I refuse, then I will write an article based on the facts I have. It will be less precise, more speculative, but no less sensational. And it will probably raise a lot of uncomfortable questions from law enforcement and civil liberties advocates. Evan walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, painting the rooftops of Lakeview in shades of red and gold. Beautiful and unsettling at the same time. Why do you think publishing such an article is a good idea? He asked without turning around. If Cassandra really does help prevent crimes, wouldn't it be better to keep it a secret? Because the public has a right to know that their data is being used to profile potential criminals, Rachel replied, and Evan could hear the conviction in her voice. Because this technology raises fundamental questions about privacy, the presumption of innocence, free will. These are questions that should be discussed openly, not decided behind closed doors by a select few. Evan turned to face her. Rachel King didn't look like the sensationalist he'd imagined. In her eyes he saw intelligence, integrity, and something else. A genuine interest in the topic that went beyond a simple desire for a big story. If I agree to an interview, he said slowly, I want complete control over what is published. No technical details that could allow someone to reproduce the algorithm. No names on the Cassandra list. And I will be an anonymous source. No photos. No mention of my name. Control over publication is too much. Rachel shook her head. But I can agree to a preliminary review of the text and the opportunity to point out factual errors. As for anonymity, it is possible, but it will reduce the credibility of the article. Then a pseudonym and a changed appearance in the photos. I don't want every person on Cassandra's list to know where to find me. Rachel considered the offer, then nodded. Agreed. When can we start? Not today. Evan felt exhausted at the thought of a long interview. I need to prepare and discuss this with the interested party. Detective Chen. Rachel smiled at the surprise on his face. I told you I was talking to police sources. Don't worry, I won't mention her name without her permission. She took a business card out of her bag and put it on the table. Call me when you're ready. But don't wait too long, Dr. Reed. Stories like these have a way of leaking out, even when we don't want them to. After Rachel left, Evan immediately called Maya. Her reaction was predictably harsh. Are you going to give an interview? Are you crazy? This will jeopardize all investigations related to the Cassandra data. I have no choice, Maya. She already knows enough to write an article. If I don't give an interview, she'll write one based on her guesses and rumors, which could be even more dangerous. And you believe you can control what she writes? She's a journalist, Evan. Her job is to dig up dirty secrets. She struck me as principled and genuinely interested in the ethical aspects of the technology, not just the sensationalism. Maya sighed, and even through the phone, Evan could feel her disappointment. Do whatever you want, but don't mention me, and don't share details about how you monitored the people on the list. It could undermine any future legal cases against them. I'll be careful, Evan promised, and maybe that's for the best. Public discussion could lead to official recognition of Cassandra, to a legal framework for its use. Or privacy and civil rights lawsuits, Maya said darkly. Be careful, Evan. You're playing with fire. After his conversation with Maya, Evan returned to working on the algorithm, but he couldn't concentrate. Thoughts about the upcoming interview, the possible consequences of publication, the public reaction, did not give him peace. He opened the new list that Cassandra had created the day before. 20 names ranked by their likelihood of committing a violent crime in the next 3 months. Marcus Fisher was still in second place, with a probability of 89.2%, even higher than on the original list. Evan studied his profile, updated with the latest information. Increasing isolation, problems at work, searches for suicide methods and mass shootings, an online purchase of a hunting knife, a classic case of a man on the verge of a breakdown. A man who can still be saved or stopped with timely intervention. Evan sent an updated dossier to Maya, highlighting the growing risk and recommending increased surveillance. Then he went back to preparing for his interview with Rachel King. He had to think carefully about what to say and what not to say, how to present Cassandra in the most positive light, how to answer the inevitable questions about the ethics and legality of the project. It was a high-stakes game, and Evan couldn't afford to lose. The interview with Rachel King lasted 3 hours. Evan spoke about the concept of predictive analytics in law enforcement, the potential of machine learning to identify patterns that precede violent crime, and the balance between security and privacy. He was careful, avoiding technical details, not mentioning specific data collection methods that might raise legal questions, and presented Cassandra as a research project, an experimental tool, not an operating system already in use by the police. Rachel was an impressive interviewer, prepared, insightful, asking pointed questions that sometimes made Evan uncomfortable. You talk about preventing crime, she said at one point, but doesn't your algorithm risk criminalizing thoughts? Aren't we moving toward a society where people are punished for what they might do, rather than what they actually did? Cassandra does not pass judgment, Evan replied, choosing his words carefully. It merely indicates increased risk based on objective behavioral patterns. The decision on how to use that information is always up to the individual, police officers, investigators, judges. But doesn't the very fact of being watched change a person's behavior? If a potential criminal is watched 24/7, doesn't that create pressure that could push him to relapse? Evan paused to answer. The question had been bothering him, especially since the incident with Dawson. "It's a difficult ethical question," he finally said. "We have to find a balance between preventive measures and respect for individual autonomy. Perhaps the solution lies in more subtle forms of intervention, not just surveillance, but offering help, support, resources to people at risk." Rachel nodded, taking notes. "Last question. What motivated you to create Cassandra? What led a Silicon Valley machine learning specialist to develop an algorithm to predict crime in a small town like Lakeview?" Evan knew she had the answer. Knew she wanted to hear the personal story, the emotional motivation behind the dry algorithms and code. "My sister," he said quietly. "She was murdered 3 months ago. The crime remains unsolved. I created Cassandra to help find her killer and prevent such tragedies from happening in the future." It was true, but not the whole truth. He didn't tell of his obsession, of the sleepless nights, of how Lisa's image haunted him in his nightmares, of how Cassandra had gradually evolved from a tool for seeking justice into something more, a way to control chaos, to predict the unpredictable, to gain power over the future. After Rachel left, Evan felt strangely empty. It was as if he had opened a door that could not be closed. Cassandra was no longer his secret, his personal project. Soon the whole city, and perhaps the whole country, would know about it. He didn't know whether to be happy or afraid about this. The article came out a week after the interview. "Crime predictor, scientific breakthrough or invasion of privacy," screamed the headline on the front page of the Lakeview Gazette. Below it was a photograph of Evan in semi-shadow. His features altered as they had agreed. Rachel kept her promise. The writing was balanced, factually accurate, and free of technical details that might allow the algorithm to be replicated. She presented both sides of the debate, the potential benefits of predictive analytics in preventing crime, and the risks to civil liberties and privacy. But there was one major deviation from their agreement. The paper cited specific cases in which the algorithm had successfully predicted crimes. No names, but enough detail that those familiar with the situation could identify Dawson and Turner. And in the section on Cassandra's methodology, Rachel mentioned that the algorithm analyzes social media behavior, financial transactions, criminal history, and even medical records to create risk profiles. Evan read the article with growing alarm. These details could attract the attention of not only the public, but also law enforcement agencies interested in issues of illegal access to protected data. His fears were confirmed when the phone rang. It was Maya, and she was furious. "Have you seen the article? It practically exposed the surveillance methods. Now any lawyer will be able to challenge arrests based on Cassandra data." "I saw. She broke our agreement." "This isn't just a breach of agreement, Evan. It's an undermining of months of work, and a potential threat to people who would have been victims of crimes if we hadn't intervened." Evan wanted to argue, to say that the article had still presented Cassandra in largely positive terms, that public debate was inevitable. But he knew Maya was right. They had passed the point of no return. "What are we going to do?" he asked instead. "I don't know," Maya said, her voice weary. "The chief called me on the carpet. He wants to know about unauthorized collaboration with a civilian. The feds are showing interest in data collection methods. This is getting heated, Evan. We can put the project on hold, for now, until things calm down." "We may have to," Maya agreed. "But first we need to finish with the current cases, especially Fisher. His behavior is becoming increasingly alarming. He had an argument with the school principal yesterday, threatening to make everyone sorry. We've increased surveillance, but I'm worried he could snap at any moment." After talking to Maya, Evan updated Fisher's data in Cassandra. The algorithm recalculated the probability, 94.7%, the highest rate ever in the system's operation. Evan looked at the number, feeling a chill down his spine. Cassandra practically screamed danger from this man. He pulled up Fisher's profile, scanning the latest data. Consensual school dismissal, increasing isolation, lack of social contact, searches for improvised explosive devices, classic mass shooter profile in the making. Evan sent an urgent update to Maya, recommending maximum monitoring and readiness for immediate intervention. Then he returned to the article, reading it over and over, trying to anticipate the implications. The public backlash, the legal issues, the possible investigation of his data-gathering methods. But what worried him most was the reference to specific cases. If Dawson and Turner recognized themselves in the article, if they realized that they had been arrested based on an algorithmic prediction rather than random police surveillance. And then it hit him. Fisher, a school teacher with internet access, and enough intelligence to put 2 and 2 together. If he read the article, if he realized he wasn't being watched by chance, but because an algorithm had flagged him as a potential criminal. Evan grabbed his phone to warn Maya, but before he could dial the number, the computer screen flickered to show a local news alert. Breaking, armed man barricaded inside Lakeview High School. Police evacuate building. Shots fired reported. Under the headline is a photograph of the school surrounded by police cars with flashing lights, and the name of the suspect, already known to journalists, Marcus Fisher. Cassandra was right, but the prediction came true too soon, too suddenly, too catastrophically. And Evan couldn't shake the feeling that it was the article that revealed the existence of the crime-predicting algorithm that was the trigger that turned a potential threat into a real tragedy. Rain pounded the roof of the police van, turning the world beyond the fogged windows into a blur of blue lights and yellow tape. Evan sat on a metal bench, clutching a long cold coffee. Across from him, Maya Chen was looking over the incident reports from Lakeview High School. Her face stony, but her fingers turning the pages betrayed the tension within her. 2 dead, she finally said, closing the folder. The school principal and a security guard. 4 more wounded, including Fisher himself. He tried to shoot himself when the SWAT team burst into the office, but the bullet only grazed his temporal lobe. Will he survive? Evan's voice sounded hoarse, as if it belonged to someone else. Doctors say yes, but the neurological consequences are unpredictable. He may wake up with amnesia, or on the contrary, with a perfectly preserved memory of every second of his breakdown. Evan set his cup down on the bench, noticing that his hands were shaking. Fatigue, stress, shock, or all 3 had turned his normally precise movements into clumsy ones, as if he were a puppet with tangled strings. "It's my fault," he said quietly. The article, it should have been the catalyst. Fisher read about Cassandra, realized he was being watched, and it pushed him into action before the algorithm predicted. We don't know for sure. Maya shook her head. They found a copy of the newspaper article in his house, but there's no evidence that it triggered the breakdown. He had problems at work, financial difficulties, a history of mental illness, which Cassandra factored into its prediction. Evan interrupted. The algorithm predicted that it would fail, but it didn't factor in the fact that it exists, how knowledge of observation changes the behavior of an object. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the 3-day stubble. How many hours had passed since he saw the news about the school shooting? 12? 18? Time lost its meaning in the whirlwind of events. The emergency call to Maya, the drive to the school, the endless hours of waiting while SWAT negotiated with Fisher and then stormed the building. What now? He asked, looking into Maya's eyes. With Cassandra? With us? Maya sighed, leaning back against the hard back of the bench. Officially, the project is on hold. The police chief is furious about the article, about my failure to report, my cooperation with a civilian consultant. I've been suspended from active investigations for 2 weeks, with pay, but it is effectively a probationary period. I'm sorry. Not worth it. I knew what I was getting into. She paused, collecting her thoughts. But there's another problem. The feds are interested in Cassandra, not just the data collection methods, but the algorithm itself. They think the technology could have national significance. Evan tensed. He'd worked on enough government contracts in Silicon Valley to know what that meant. They want to gain control over the algorithm, not just surveillance. They want to scale it up, integrate it into the national security system. Imagine a Cassandra analyzing data not from a small town, but from an entire country, identifying potential terrorists, mass shooters, political extremists. It's a disaster. Evan shook his head. The algorithm isn't ready for this scale. It's still learning, adapting, and needs fine-tuning. And even in perfect condition, the false positive rate is too high for national use. I tried to explain this to the agent who contacted me, but he was more interested in the technical possibilities than the limitations. Evan stood up, unable to sit still. The van suddenly felt cramped and stuffy, despite the air conditioning. I need to get back to the office, check on Cassandra, analyze what went wrong with Fisher's prediction. Evan. Maya's voice stopped him halfway to the door. You realize this could be dangerous? After the article, your anonymity is in question. If the feds decide the algorithm is of national security interest, I know. He turned, and Maya was struck by the look on his face, a mixture of determination and despair. But I have to understand what happened. Why Cassandra didn't foresee the article becoming a catalyst. How to improve the algorithm to avoid similar mistakes in the future. What if the best solution is to stop the project? To admit that some things should not be predicted? Evan looked at her for a long moment, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Do you really believe that? After everything we've learned? After Dawson, Turner? We could have prevented today's tragedy if we had acted faster, more effectively. Or, we created the conditions that made it inevitable, Maya said quietly. The surveillance, the pressure, the article. All of that could have pushed Fisher into a breakdown that would never have happened otherwise. Evan wanted to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Because somewhere deep inside, he knew that Maya might be right. That Cassandra, created to prevent crime, might actually be the cause. I have to go. he said instead of answering. "I'll contact you later." He stepped out of the van into the drizzle, turned up the collar of his jacket, and headed toward his car, parked outside the police perimeter. Thoughts swarmed in his head like disturbed wasps. Analysis of the algorithm's error, concerns about federal interest, images of the victims of today's shooting, seen on stretchers being carried out of the school. And deeper, darker, a thought. He didn't want to admit even to himself, what if the whole concept of Cassandra was fundamentally flawed? What if trying to predict and prevent crime was creating self-fulfilling prophecies? The office greeted Evan with the familiar hum of servers and flickering monitors. He turned on the extra lights, but left the far corner in semi-darkness where Lisa's photo hung on the wall. He couldn't look her in the eye today. The first thing he did was check his security system. Digital locks, surveillance cameras, motion sensors. After Rachel King's article, he stepped up his security measures, fearing attention from both potential criminals on the Cassandra list and law enforcement agencies interested in his data collection methods. Once he was sure all systems were working properly, Evan sat down at his computer and dove into Fisher's case. He pulled up all the data that Cassandra had used to form its prediction. Search history, social media activity, financial transactions, therapist appointment records, obtained through questionable access to an insurance company database. The algorithm correctly identified an increasing risk of violent breakdown based on classic indicators: social isolation, financial stress, interest in guns, history of mental health problems, recent triggers in the form of problems at work. But he could not take into account the influence of the article on Cassandra, the observer effect, changing the observed system itself. Evan began modifying the algorithm, adding new parameters that accounted for this effect. How does knowledge of an observation change the behavior of an object? How does public disclosure of prediction methods affect the predictions themselves? The hours dissolved into a stream of code. Evan worked like a man possessed, pausing only to drink more coffee or stretch his aching shoulders. It grew dark outside, then light again, but he barely noticed the change from day to night. On the second day of non-stop work, when fatigue began to take its toll, and the lines of code began to blur before my eyes, there was a knock at the door. Evan winced, instantly switching to the security camera in the hallway. Rachel King was on the screen, with dark circles under her eyes, and an expression that could only be described as a mixture of guilt and determination. His first impulse was to ignore the knock. After the article, after the tragedy at the school, the last person he wanted to see was the journalist who had revealed the existence of Cassandra to the world. But something in her posture, the tension in her shoulders, made him go to the door. He opened it, leaving the chain in place. "What do you want?" His voice sounded hoarse from the long silence. "To talk," Rachel said simply. "About the article, about what happened at school, about what I found after." The last words caught Evan's attention. He removed the chain and opened the door wider, letting the journalist inside. Rachel walked into the office, taking in the changes that had taken place since her last visit. New monitors, additional security systems, a whiteboard now, filled with an analysis of Fisher's case. "You haven't slept," she noted, looking at Evan. "Since the shooting?" "I'm working," he answered shortly. "What did you find?" Rachel pulled a tablet out of her bag and opened the file, a scan of a handwritten letter on lined paper. This was found in Fisher's house. a sort of manifesto. He planned to send it to the editor after the shooting. Evan picked up the tablet, reading the jagged lines written in the hand of a man in a state of extreme emotional arousal. They're watching me, not just the police, a system. An algorithm that knows what I'll do before I know it. I read about it in the paper. Cassandra, they call it. A machine that turns people into numbers, into probabilities, into potential criminals. They think they can control the future, prevent crimes before they happen. But what if their very observation creates criminals? What if I would never do what I'm about to do if I didn't know they expected me to? I don't want to be predictable. I don't want to be just a line in their algorithm. So I'm going to do something they don't expect. I'm going to do it before they predict. I'm going to prove that the human spirit can't be reduced to equations and probabilities. The letter continued for several more paragraphs, a jumbled stream of consciousness from a man on the verge of a mental breakdown, a mixture of paranoia, philosophical musings, and pure rage. Evan put the tablet down, feeling a chill run down his spine. The article was the catalyst, he said quietly. He read about Cassandra and decided to prove that the algorithm couldn't control him by committing a crime earlier than predicted. Yes, Rachel took the tablet back, her face pale. And I feel responsible for that. I should have been more careful with the details I included in the article. Why are you showing this to me and not the police? The police have already received a copy, but I wanted you to know too because... She paused, choosing her words. Because I think we're both responsible for what happened. And because there's something else the police don't know. She opened her bag again and took out the flash drive. After the article was published, I received an anonymous tip. Someone claiming to work for a government agency interested in crime prediction technology provided documents about a project codenamed Labyrinth, an experimental program very similar to your Cassandra, but on a much larger scale and with fewer ethical restrictions. Evan took the flash drive, twirling it in his fingers. Why do you trust this source? It could be disinformation. I checked some details. Names, dates, places, everything matches publicly available information, and the documents have all the hallmarks of authenticity. Formatting, security classifications, specific bureaucratic language. She leaned closer, lowering her voice as if she was afraid they might be overheard. According to these documents, Maze has been operating for 3 years. They use data from social networks, financial transactions, phone calls, even medical records, all without proper warrants or judicial oversight. And they don't just watch potential criminals, they actively intervene, creating situations that can provoke or prevent predicted actions, depending on their goals. Evan felt his heart speed up. If what Rachel said was true, it meant that his fears about federal interest in Cassandra were more than justified. Why are you telling me this? Because I think they're coming for you and your algorithm. They may already be coming. And because I think the public needs to know about the labyrinth, how the government is using predictive technology to control its citizens. Do you want to write another article? Was not a question. Yes. But this time, I want to do it right, with your help, with a full understanding of the technology and its limitations, with an emphasis on ethical issues and the need for public oversight. Evan turned away, going to the window. The rain had started again, turning the city below into a blur of lights and shadows. He thought about Cassandra, about his original intentions in creating it. To find Lisa's killer, to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future. how those intentions had gradually morphed into something more complex, more ambitious, more dangerous. And what might happen if such technology ended up in the hands of people for whom ethical restrictions were just an obstacle on the way to their goal. "I'll help you," he finally said, turning to Rachel. "But first, I need to see those documents, and I need to finish analyzing Fisher's case, figure out what went wrong with the algorithm. How much time do you need? A day? Maybe 2? I'll contact you when I'm ready." After Rachel left, Evan immediately connected the flash drive to an isolated computer not connected to the main network, a precaution in case the device contained malware. The documents looked authentic: internal memos, test reports, technical specifications for Project Labyrinth. The more he read, the more uneasy he became. Labyrinth wasn't just a big-budget Cassandra, it was a system of active intervention that used predictions to manipulate reality, to create situations that could provoke potential criminals to take actions that would justify their arrest, or conversely, to prevent the actions of people who posed a threat to certain interests. One document described a kill operation, a person identified by an algorithm as having a high probability of revealing classified information. The operation involved the creation of incriminating materials, financial pressure, and even the manipulation of medical records to cast doubt on the target's mental health. It was a dystopia made real, and Cassandra could have become part of it if it had fallen into the same hands. Evan unplugged the flash drive and returned to his main computer. He had to finish analyzing the Fisher case to understand the fundamental problem with the algorithm, the observer effect, which changes the observed system itself. But now he had another goal: to create a protection for Cassandra, a mechanism that would prevent it from being used for labyrinth-style manipulation. He worked through the night, balancing analysis of the bug with the development of protective protocols. By dawn, he had a plan. Not perfect, but the best he could come up with in the limited time he had. The first step was to create Theseus, a counter-algorithm named after the hero who defeated the Minotaur in the labyrinth. Theseus was designed not to predict crime, but to detect instances where Cassandra-type systems were creating self-fulfilling prophecies or were being used for manipulation. The second step was to distribute the key components of Cassandra across different servers, with encryption and self-destruction mechanisms in case of unauthorized access. No one, not even Evan himself, could recreate the full algorithm without all the components and decryption keys. The third step was to create a public version of the code, one with limited functionality but detailed enough for experts to understand how the algorithm worked and its limitations. This version would be part of Rachel's paper, a demonstration of openness and a call for public oversight of prediction technology. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, Evan leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. He had done everything he could to protect his creation from abuse. Now all that was left was to wait for the reaction. Rachel's to his plan, the feds to the article he was preparing, the public to the revelation of the Labyrinth project, and, perhaps most importantly, Cassandra's reactions to its own modification. The algorithm learned, adapted, evolved with each new data set. How will it react to the realization of its influence on the reality it was trying to predict? Evan didn't know the answer, but he was prepared to face the consequences of his actions, whatever they might be. A call from Maya woke him up after several hours of restless sleep on the office sofa. "Evan, have you seen the news?" Her voice was tense, with a note of worry. He hadn't heard before. "No, I was sleeping. What happened?" Fisher regained consciousness, and the first thing he did was demand a lawyer and reporters. He claims that he was the victim of a government experiment in mind control. That Cassandra is not just a prediction algorithm, but a manipulation tool that makes people commit crimes. That would never have happened otherwise. Evan sat up on the couch, instantly waking up. This is nonsense. Cassandra can't control minds or make people do things. I know. But his story sounds plausible enough to those who don't understand the technology. Especially after your interview with Rachel King, where you talked about predicting crimes before they happen. What do the doctors say about his condition? They are cautious in their assessments. The bullet grazed his temporal lobe, but did not cause critical damage. His speech and memory appear intact, but there may be personality changes, paranoia, confabulation. When the brain fills in gaps in memory with made-up details. So no one takes him seriously? On the contrary, Maya said, her voice irritated. His lawyer has already given a press conference, demanding an investigation into the Lakeview police methods and the Cassandra project. Some media outlets have picked up on the story, especially those that specialize in conspiracy theories and government criticism. Evan cursed, getting up from the couch and walking over to his computer. He quickly pulled up news sites, scanning. The headlines: Lakeview High School shooter claims he was victim of government experiment. Cassandra algorithm, predicting crimes or creating them. Mind control in small-town America, science fiction or reality. This is a disaster, he muttered. This is exactly the reaction I was afraid of after the article. There's something else. Maya's voice grew even more tense. The feds have obtained a warrant to search your office and seize all computers and data related to Cassandra. They'll be with you in about an hour. Evan felt a chill run down his spine. On what basis? Officially, they are suspected of illegally collecting personal data and violating federal cybersecurity laws. Unofficially, they want to gain control of the algorithm before the story gets too big. How do you know? I still have friends in the department, despite the suspension. One of them overheard the feds talking to the chief. Evan quickly assessed the situation. An hour wasn't much time, but it was enough to activate the defense protocols he'd developed overnight. Thanks for the warning, Maya. I'll take care of Cassandra. Evan. Her voice softened, almost caring. Be careful. These people don't joke around, and maybe you should consider disappearing for a while, until things get clearer. Are you suggesting that I run away? I suggest you protect yourself and your job. After speaking with Maya, Evan immediately began activating the security protocols. He launched scripts that distributed Cassandra components across different servers, encrypted key algorithms, and installed mechanisms for self-destruction of data in the event of unauthorized access. He then packed the most important documents and the flash drive with the labyrinth materials into a small bag. He also added a spare laptop, external hard drives with backup copies of the code, and several $1,000s in cash, which he kept in case of an emergency. The last thing to go into the bag was a small object wrapped in soft cloth, a framed photograph of Lisa, the only personal item in his ascetic office. Before leaving, Evan sent 2 messages. The first was to Rachel King, with an encrypted link to the public version of the Cassandra code and a brief instruction. Publish everything. Now. The second one is for Maya, with the coordinates of the meeting place and time. The abandoned Aurora Cinema, midnight. Then he activated the final security protocol, a complete wipe of all local data on the computers in the office. By the time the feds arrived with a warrant, they would find empty machines and erased drives. Evan took one last look around the office that had become his home for the last few months. The control center of the future, Rachel had called it. The birthplace of Cassandra, an algorithm that was supposed to save lives but might have created more problems than it solved. He walked out the back door, down the fire escape, and into the morning stream of pedestrians heading to work. An ordinary man, with a bag over his shoulder, one of many. No one paid attention to him. No one knew that his head held the keys to an algorithm that could predict the future. And no one guessed that this algorithm had already predicted its creator's next move, and all the possible consequences of that move, including those that Evan himself could not yet foresee. The abandoned Aurora Cinema looked even more ominous at night than it did during the day. The moon periodically peeked out from behind the clouds, illuminating the ruined facade and broken windows with a ghostly silver light. The wind drove scraps of old posters across the empty parking lot, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. Evan waited in the shadow of the ruined ticket booth, watching the driveway. He'd spent the day in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, keeping up with the news on his spare laptop. Events were moving fast. Rachel's article about Project Maze had appeared in the online Lakeview Gazette and quickly spread to national media. Federal agents had indeed searched his office but apparently found nothing useful. And Fisher was still giving interviews from his hospital room, his story growing more convoluted and paranoid. And Cassandra, distributed across different servers, continued to work, analyze data, learn from its mistakes. Evan periodically checked its status through an encrypted connection. The algorithm adapted to new conditions, integrating an understanding of the observer effect into its predictions. At 11:58 p.m., a grey sedan with its headlights off pulled into the deserted parking lot. Maya, accurate as always. Evan stepped out of the shadows, allowing her to see him. She parked next to the cash register and got out of the car, looking around warily. "No one was following you?" Evan asked by way of greeting. "No. I checked." She stepped closer, studying his face in the moonlight. "You look terrible." "Thanks for the compliment." He tried to smile, but it came out unconvincing. "How are things in town?" "Chaotic. King's Labyrinth article has caused quite a storm. Congressmen are demanding investigations. Civil rights activists are filing lawsuits. Conspiracy theorists are celebrating confirmation of their worst fears." "What about the feds who came for Cassandra?" "They're furious. They searched your office, but apparently all they found were empty computers. They questioned me, but I couldn't tell them much. Technically, I didn't even know how the algorithm worked. I just got the results." Evan nodded, relieved. The protective protocols had worked. "What now?" Maya asked. "You can't hide forever." "I know. I have a plan." Evan pulled a laptop out of his bag and opened it, showing Maya the screen with the program running. "This is Theseus, a counter-algorithm I developed. It doesn't predict crimes, but rather identifies instances where systems like Cassandra or Labyrinth are creating conditions for self-fulfilling prophecies or are being used for manipulation." Maya leaned closer, studying the program's interface. "And how will this help?" "I plan to make Theseus open source, available to everyone. a tool for citizen control over predictive technologies. If governments or corporations use algorithms like Cassandra to manipulate, Theseus will be able to detect it. That sounds noble, but it doesn't solve your current problem. The feds still want Cassandra and her creator. I know. So the second part of the plan is a public appearance. I'll contact Rachel King, give a full interview about Cassandra, its capabilities and limitations. I'll talk about the Fisher case, how the algorithm failed to take into account the observer effect, about the risks of predictive technologies, and the need for public scrutiny. It's dangerous, Maya shook her head. You'll be a target not only for the feds, but for anyone who believes in government mind control conspiracy theories. I have no choice. The story is already out of control. The only way to direct it in a constructive direction is to become part of the discussion, not hide from it. Maya looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. You've changed, Evan. When we first met in my office, you were obsessed with control. Predicting crime, preventing it, finding Lisa's killer. Now you talk about openness, about citizen control, about recognizing the limitations of technology. I realized something important, Evan said quietly. You can't control the future. You can only face it with your eyes open. Cassandra was my attempt to gain control over chaos, over randomness, over the pain of losing Lisa. But in the process, I created a tool that could do more harm than good. He closed the laptop and put it back in his bag. I still believe that predictive technologies can save lives, but only if they are used with a full understanding of their limitations, within ethical boundaries, with public oversight. And you think society is ready for such technology? No. But it should be able to decide this itself and not have the technology imposed on it from above by the government or corporations. Maya nodded, accepting his argument. What do you want me to do? Help me set up a meeting with Rachel King. Somewhere safe where the feds can't interrupt us and... He paused. I want you there. As a law enforcement official, as someone who's seen the good and the bad of Cassandra. Do you realize that this could cost me my career? Yes, and I wouldn't ask if I didn't think it was really important. Maya was silent for a long time, looking at the destroyed cinema, at the moon, periodically hiding behind the clouds, at the empty parking lot that held the ghosts of the past. I will help you, she said at last. Not for Cassandra or Theseus, but for what I believe in. Justice, truth, the defense of the innocent. Evan felt relief and gratitude, emotions that seemed almost forgotten in the chaos of the last few days. Thank you, Maya. She nodded, then looked at her watch. I have to go. I'll contact you tomorrow when I arrange a meeting with King. After Maya left, Evan was alone in the empty parking lot. He looked at the abandoned movie theater, at the ruined Aurora sign, named after the goddess of dawn, new beginnings. Perhaps this was the right place to plan the next step. To rethink Cassandra and her role in the world. To begin a new chapter in a story that began with tragedy and obsession, but could end with something more constructive, more ethical, more human. Evan pulled out his phone and opened an encrypted connection to Cassandra. The algorithm continued to work, analyzing data, learning from its mistakes. But now Evan saw it not as a tool of control, but as a mirror reflecting the complexity of human behavior, the unpredictability of free will, the paradoxes of causality. Cassandra couldn't predict the future with absolute accuracy, not because the algorithm was flawed, but because the future itself was not predetermined. It was created by every decision, every action, every interaction between people and the systems they created. And perhaps in this uncertainty there was not only danger, but also hope. Hope that the future could not only be predicted, but also created, consciously, ethically, collectively. With that thought in mind, Evan left the abandoned movie theater parking lot, heading into the unknown that lay ahead. A future that even Cassandra couldn't predict with certainty. The conference room at the Eastern District Federal Court was packed. Journalists, lawyers, activists, and tech companies were there for the first public hearing in United States versus Reed, a landmark case in the fight for digital rights and the ethics of artificial intelligence. Evan sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed in a sharp gray suit that nonetheless sagged on his frame, which had grown thinner in the last 6 months. Next to him was attorney Daniel Harris, a renowned digital lawyer who had agreed to take the case pro bono because of its precedent-setting nature. Evan noticed familiar faces in the room. Maya Chen, who had been suspended but had regained her reputation thanks to her role in exposing the Maze Project. Rachel King, who had won a Pulitzer Prize for a series of articles about predictive technologies and their impact on society. Professor Eleanor Vasquez, an expert in the ethics of artificial intelligence who had become a key witness for the defense. 6 months ago, after the Labyrinth story was published, Evan decided to stop hiding and voluntarily surrendered to authorities, but on his own terms, with a press conference where he explained how Cassandra works, its limitations and risks. He was arrested on charges of illegal data collection, computer fraud, and abuse of access to protected information, charges that could have carried decades in prison. But his openness, willingness to cooperate, and most importantly, the public outcry surrounding the case, led to the court agreeing to release him on bail until the trial began. Evan used those months not to flee, but to work on Theseus, an algorithm that detects manipulation of prediction systems, which he released as open source. Now that the trial had finally begun, Evan felt a strange calm. Not the resignation of inevitable punishment, but the confidence of a man who had made a conscious choice and was ready to accept its consequences. Judge Elizabeth Morrow, an older woman with piercing eyes and a reputation for being fair but strict, walked into the courtroom. Everyone in the room stood. "Please be seated," she said, taking her seat. "Today we begin the hearing in the case of United States versus Evan Reed. Given the unprecedented nature of this case and its importance in shaping the jurisprudence regarding artificial intelligence technologies, I have authorized an expanded hearing format, including expert testimony on technical and ethical issues." She turned to the prosecution table, where 2 federal prosecutors sat. The prosecution may present its case. Prosecutors spent the next 2 hours methodically laying out their case. Evan Reed, driven by personal tragedy and a thirst for revenge, created an illegal surveillance system that violated citizens' fundamental rights to privacy. He illegally accessed secure databases, created profiles of thousands of innocent people, effectively turning them into suspects without due process. His actions led to tragedy at Lakeview High School, when Marcus Fisher, learning he was being watched, committed the very crime the algorithm had predicted. Evan listened to the accusations with a straight face, showing no emotion. Much of it was true. He had indeed violated privacy laws. He had indeed gained unauthorized access to data. but the prosecution portrayed him as an irresponsible hacker hell-bent on revenge, ignoring the more complex reality of his motives and actions. When it came to the defense, Daniel Harris began not by refuting the facts, but by looking at the broader context. Your Honor, we do not dispute that Dr. Reed accessed certain data without proper authorization, but we ask the court to consider the context of those actions and their full implications. He presented a timeline of events, beginning with the murder of Lisa Reed and ending with the revelation of Project Labyrinth, a government program that used methods similar to Cassandra, but without the ethical constraints and public scrutiny. Dr. Reed created Cassandra with the intention of saving lives to prevent tragedies like the one that happened to his sister. When he realized the limitations and dangers of his invention, he did not hide them, but made them public. He created Theseus, a tool that allows society to protect itself from manipulation by prediction systems. He voluntarily surrendered himself to the authorities to take responsibility for his actions. Harris paused, looking around the room. This is not just a case about violating privacy laws. It is a case about the balance between security and freedom, about the limits of technological intervention in human life, about who should control the tools that can predict and potentially shape the future. Judge Morrow listened attentively, occasionally taking notes. When Harris finished his opening statement, she called a recess before the presentation of evidence, and witnesses began. In the courtroom hallway, Evan made eye contact with Maya, who was standing by the window. She approached him as security, pulled him aside for a brief conversation with his lawyer. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Better than I expected," Evan replied. "It's a weird feeling sitting there listening to people discuss your actions, your motives, as if you were a character in a book and not a real person." "I know that feeling," Maya nodded. "I went through it during an internal investigation." She paused, then added more quietly, "Theseus found something interesting about your sister's case." Evan tensed. Despite everything that had happened in the last few months, Lisa's murder remained a raw wound, the root cause of everything that had happened. What exactly? A pattern in unsolved murders in 3 states, similar patterns, time frames, choice of victims, and a connection to a man never considered a suspect, Richard Klein, assistant director of the FBI's regional office. The same office that oversaw the Labyrinth project? Exactly. Maya glanced over her shoulder, making sure they weren't being overheard. "I've started my own investigation. Unofficially, but with the help of Theseus, I found a few leads that were missed in the original investigation." Evan felt conflicting emotions wrestle within him. Hope that Lisa's killer would finally be found, bitterness that it might be a person representing the law, and a strange sense of a vicious circle. The algorithm created to find the killer, after all the transformations, returns to its original purpose. "Keep me informed," he said, seeing that security was signaling the need to return to the hall. "And be careful. If you're right, this man is dangerous." Maya nodded, and in her eyes Evan saw the same determination he had felt in himself at the beginning of his work on Cassandra, the determination to find the truth no matter how inconvenient it might be. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Prosecutors presented technical evidence of illegal access to databases. Experts discussed the ethical aspects of prediction algorithms. Witnesses spoke about the impact of Cassandra on their lives, both positive and negative. Marcus Fisher testified via video link from a prison hospital, stabilized but still requiring medical supervision. His version of events evolved from the initial allegations of mind control to a more nuanced understanding of how knowledge of the surveillance and the Cassandra article had affected his mental state, leading him to take actions he might never have taken otherwise. "I take no responsibility for what I did," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I pulled the trigger. I hurt innocent people, but I was also part of a system, an experiment, that created the conditions for my breakdown. I was both the subject and the object of a predictive algorithm." His testimony made a strong impression on those present, including Judge Morrow, who asked several clarifying questions about his mental state before and after the publication of the Cassandra article. On the 9th day of the trial, it was Evan's turn to testify. He took the stand, took the oath, and prepared to answer questions that could determine not only his fate, but the future of predictive technology. Daniel Harris started with simple questions about his education, work experience, the circumstances of the creation of Cassandra. Then he moved on to more complex topics. "Dr. Reed, when did you begin to realize the potential problems with your algorithm? The moment you realized that Cassandra could not only predict, but also influence the events it predicted?" Evan took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. "After the incident with Marcus Fisher, when I saw how the publication of the article about Cassandra changed his behavior, accelerated the events that the algorithm predicted for a later date. I realized that I had created a classic example of the observer effect, a situation where the very act of observation changes the observed system." "And how did you react to this realization?" "I started modifying the algorithm to try to account for this effect, but I soon realized that the problem was deeper. It was not just a technical limitation, but a fundamental ethical question about whether we have the right to predict people's actions, potentially depriving them of their freedom of choice. About how the very knowledge of the prediction can become a self-fulfilling prophecy." "And that's what led you to create Theseus?" "Yes. I realized that if you can't create a perfect prediction algorithm, you need to create a tool that will help society protect itself from the abuse of such algorithms. Theseus identifies cases where systems like Cassandra or Labyrinth create conditions for self-fulfilling prophecies or are used for manipulation." The prosecutor's cross-examination was tough but predictable, focusing on illegal data collection methods, the lack of official permission to cooperate with police, and the role of Cassandra in the Lakeview tragedy. "Mr. Reed, do you admit that your actions led to the deaths of 2 people at Lakeview High School?" Evan met the prosecutor's gaze without hesitation. "I accept my share of responsibility for this tragedy." Cassandra correctly identified the risk posed by Marcus Fisher, but failed to consider how public disclosure of her existence would affect his behavior. This was a fundamental flaw in the algorithm's design, and I bear responsibility for it. "And yet you continue to claim that your actions were justified?" "I'm not saying they were justified. I'm saying they were motivated by a genuine desire to prevent tragedies like the one that happened to my sister. I violated privacy laws, and I'm prepared to take the punishment for that. But I also believe that society needs to have an open discussion about predictive technologies, their potential and their risks, especially in light of the revelations of Project Labyrinth, which used similar techniques without any public oversight or ethical constraints." On the final day of the trial, after all the testimony and expert opinions, Judge Morrow announced that she would issue a decision in a week, given the complexity and precedent-setting nature of the case. Evan left the courthouse with his lawyer, walking through a crowd of reporters shouting questions. He did not answer, maintaining a calm, focused expression. Only once he was in the car did he allow himself a moment of weakness. He closed his eyes, leaned back in the seat, and let out a long, shaking sigh. "You held up well out there," Harris said as he got behind the wheel, "especially during the cross-examination." "I was telling the truth," Evan replied simply. "It makes things easier." "The truth doesn't always help in court," Harris said, revving the engine. "But in this case, I think it's on our side. Judge Morrow is known for her interest in technology law and AI ethics. She understands that this case goes beyond a simple violation of privacy laws." "What are our chances?" "A full acquittal." "Almost. 0. You admitted to breaking federal laws and the evidence is overwhelming. But a minimal sentence, perhaps probation instead of jail time?" "I'd say the odds are good." Evan nodded. He was ready for this. Ready to accept the consequences of his actions, whatever they might be. "What are you going to do after the trial?" Harris asked as he pulled onto the main road. "Go back to Silicon Valley?" "No." Evan shook his head. "That chapter of my life is closed. I'm thinking about teaching, maybe at a small college, a course on the ethics of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And I'll continue to work on Theseus, make it more accessible, more powerful. And Cassandra? Cassandra will remain distributed, encrypted, and not fully recoverable. Some technologies are too dangerous to exist without a robust ethical framework and public oversight. And such a framework does not yet exist." Harris nodded, understanding his client's decision. "You know, in Greek mythology, Cassandra was cursed. She could see the future, but no one believed her prophecies. Your Cassandra faced the opposite problem. She was believed too much, and this changed the very future she predicted." "Exactly," Evan agreed quietly. "And that's the paradox of any predictive system. The more accurate the prediction, the more likely it is to change the reality it's trying to predict." A week later, Evan was back in the courtroom waiting for Judge Morrow to rule. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been during the trial. The case had captured national attention, becoming emblematic of the debate over the limits of technological intervention in human life. Judge Morrow entered the courtroom, and everyone stood. She took her seat, put on her glasses, and began to read the decision. United States versus Evan. Reed represents an unprecedented legal challenge. It requires us not only to apply existing cybersecurity and privacy laws, but also to consider fundamental questions about the interaction of technology and society, the limits of prediction and free will, and the balance between security and privacy. She paused, looking around the room. The facts of this case are indisputable. Dr. Reed created the Cassandra algorithm, used unauthorized access to secure databases, and cooperated with law enforcement without official permission. These actions violate federal cybersecurity and privacy laws. Evan felt Harris tense next to him. This was not a good start. However, the judge continued, the context of these actions requires special consideration. Dr. Reed was not motivated by financial gain or malice, but by a genuine desire to prevent crime and save lives. When he realized the potential dangers of his invention, he did not hide them. He made them public. He created Theseus, a tool to help the public protect itself from manipulation by divination systems. He voluntarily surrendered to authorities and cooperated with the investigation. The judge turned the page of her notes. Moreover, the disclosure of Project Maze, made possible by the actions of Dr. Reed and journalist Rachel King, has revealed serious misconduct by government agencies using similar technologies without proper oversight and ethical constraints. The courtroom became quiet. Everyone understood that the judge was approaching the verdict. Considering all the circumstances of this case, I find Dr. Evan Reed guilty of violating federal cybersecurity and privacy laws. However, given his motives, subsequent actions, and the public significance of the information disclosed, I sentence him to 3 years of probation with 5 years of supervised release, 1,000 hours of community service in digital ethics education, and a fine of $100,000. Evan exhaled, feeling the tension of the last few months begin to ease. Not an excuse, but not a prison sentence either. A chance to continue working on Theseus, a chance to contribute to the ethical framework for predictive technology. In addition, Judge Morrow added, I recommend the creation of a special commission on the ethics of prediction algorithms, including experts in the fields of law, technology, ethics, and civil rights. Dr. Reed will be invited to serve as a consultant to this commission, given his unique experience and insight into the issues. She banged the gavel, ending the meeting. The trial is over. A year later, Evan stood before an audience of students at a small college on the outskirts of Boston. On the screen behind him was a diagram illustrating how machine learning algorithms work in the context of predictive analytics. The key question is not whether we can create an algorithm that predicts human behavior with high accuracy, he said, looking around at the attentive faces of the students. Technically, it is possible, and increasingly so with the development of big data and machine learning. The key question is whether we should do it. And if so, under what restrictions, under what ethical framework, under what public scrutiny? He paused, allowing the words to resonate in the minds of his listeners. The story of Cassandra and Labyrinth has shown us both the potential and the dangers of predictive technologies. They can save lives by preventing crimes before they happen. But they can also create self-fulfilling prophecies, violate privacy, and become tools of control and manipulation. In the back row, Evan spotted Maya Chen, who had come to his lecture unannounced, silently watching as the former creator of Cassandra now taught students how to think critically about the technologies he himself had once developed. After the lecture, when the students had left, Maya approached him. Professor Reed, she smiled, extending her hand. An impressive lecture. Detective Chen, he said, shaking her hand, noting the changes in her appearance, her new haircut, her more relaxed posture, the lack of constant tension in her gaze. Or is it? Not anymore, she confirmed. I left the police force 6 months ago. I now work for a non-profit that works on law enforcement reform. We focus on implementing ethical standards for the use of technology in policing. Sounds like important work. She is. Maya glanced around, making sure they were alone in the room. But I didn't just come to hear your lecture. I have news about Lisa's case. Evan tensed. Despite everything that had happened in the last year, his sister's murder remained a raw wound, the root cause of everything that had happened. Did you find something? Not me. Theseus, Maya pulled a tablet out of her bag and opened the file. Remember what I said about the pattern in the unsolved murders, the connection to Richard Klein of the FBI? Theseus kept analyzing the data, even after I stopped actively investigating, and 3 weeks ago, he found this. She showed Evan the screen of her tablet, a photograph taken by a security camera at a gas station near where Lisa's body had been found. It showed a middle-aged man filling up a black SUV. The date and time in the corner of the frame matched the night of the murder. "That's Klein," Evan said quietly, recognizing the face of the man he'd seen on the news during the Labyrinth scandal. "Yes, and that's not all." Maya swiped her finger across the screen, revealing the next photo, a close-up of a man's hand, revealing a distinctive crescent-shaped scar. "That scar matches the description given by the only witness to your sister's attack, a homeless man who police deemed unreliable due to his mental state." Evan felt his heart quicken. After so many months, so many twists and turns and distractions, Cassandra, or rather her evolution in the form of Theseus, had finally accomplished her original task, to find Lisa's killer. "There's something else," Maya continued, holding up a third photograph, a scan of an official FBI document. "It's a request for access to the Lakeview Police database, signed by Klein a week before Lisa was killed. He was interested in her cases. She worked with troubled teens, some of whom were witnesses in cases the FBI was investigating. She may have learned something she shouldn't have." "Something to do with Labyrinth?" Evan suggested. "Possibly. The chronology matches. The project was in an active phase at that time." Evan turned away, walking toward the classroom window. Beyond the glass, students were moving across campus, hurrying to class, laughing, talking, going about their normal lives that went on despite tragedy, crime, moral dilemmas. "What are you going to do with this information?" he asked without turning around. "I have already passed it on to the FBI Inspector General's office and several journalists, including Rachel King. The investigation will begin this week. Klein has already been suspended pending further investigation." Evan nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief that Lisa's killer had finally been identified. Bitterness that it was a man representing the law. Satisfaction that the technology he had created had finally accomplished its original purpose, albeit in a roundabout way. "Thank you, Maya," he turned to her, "for not giving up on this matter even when I was distracted by other battles. I made a promise, remember? The day you came into my office with the idea for Cassandra. I said I would find Lisa's killer, with or without your help." She came closer, and Evan noticed something new in her eyes, not just the professional determination of a detective, but human warmth, understanding, perhaps even affection. "What will you do now that Lisa's case is close to being solved?" she asked. "Will you continue teaching? Will you go back to developing AI?" Evan thought about it. The last year had changed him, transformed him from a genius obsessed with revenge into a man who took responsibility for his creations, who understood the complexities of the interaction between technology and society. "I'll stay here," he finally said. "I'll teach the next generation of AI developers to think not just about what they can create, but about the consequences of their creations. And I'll continue to work on Theseus, not as a tool for prediction, but as a means of protecting against the abuse of such technologies." He paused, then added, "And maybe when the Klein case is closed, I'll finally be able to say a real goodbye to Lisa. Not forget her, never, but let go of the pain that led to the creation of Cassandra." Maya nodded, understanding. She knew that Evan's journey from revenge to reconciliation, from control to acceptance, had been long and painful, and that it wasn't over yet. "You know," she said, looking at the screen where Evan's presentation on the ethics of predictive algorithms was still playing, "sometimes I think the real problem isn't the technology, It's our attitude toward the future. We want so desperately to control it, to predict it, to shape it. But maybe the real wisdom is in embracing uncertainty, in realizing that the future will always be somewhat unpredictable, and that that's not a curse, but a gift. Evan smiled, the first real smile he'd seen in a long time. Sounds like a topic for my next lecture. They walked out of the classroom together, heading for the building's exit. The day was clear and sunny, a rarity for a Boston autumn. Students sat on the campus lawns, reading, talking, living in the moment, not thinking about the algorithms predicting their future. And in this ordinary scene, Evan saw what had eluded him all the time he was working on Cassandra. The beauty of unpredictability, the value of freedom of choice, the dignity of human life, which cannot be reduced to probabilities and predictions. Cassandra was created out of pain and fear, out of a desire to control chaos, to prevent tragedy, to find the guilty. Theseus was born out of an awareness of the limitations of this approach, out of an understanding that prediction without ethics, without respect for human autonomy, can create more problems than it solves. What would happen next? Evan didn't know. And for the first time in a long time, this uncertainty didn't frighten him. It filled him with a strange calm. The future wasn't an algorithm to be hacked or a puzzle to be solved. It was a journey to be lived, step by step, choice by choice. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson he had learned from the whole Cassandra affair. Sometimes the best way to predict the future is to create it with your own hands, with your own decisions, with your own actions. Not alone, not through control and manipulation, but together with others, through dialogue, cooperation, mutual respect. Evan and Maya walked out of the building into the sunlight, leaving behind the shadows of the past and the algorithms that tried to predict the future. Ahead was a new day, new challenges, new opportunities, and no algorithm could predict where this path would lead them.